بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته and welcome back to another podcast episode with us here at Feed. I'm your host Shabir Hassan in this blessed month of Ramadan. SubhanAllah, it's flying past. I hope everyone's been having an extremely, inshallah, beneficial and productive Ramadan so far, and I hope you've been enjoying the podcasts that we've been putting out there to hopefully add some value to yourselves in this blessed month, whether it's to do with acts of worship or whether it's to do with spirituality in general. But here's the thing, today we have got a very special episode for you, and it's very relevant to the month of Ramadan because Ramadan is a month of the Quran, and we must, of course, have a podcast episode which is dedicated to the Quran. It's just a must, right? Especially as we're approaching the end of Ramadan, there's a lot that we can kind of learn, inshallah, from today's episode to implement and to kind of make use of those last few moments that we have in this month, and then how to kind of take it forward as well outside of Ramadan, inshallah. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce a very dear brother of mine who I'm actually meeting for the first time, but I feel like I've known him for a long time myself. The founder of what you've probably heard of actually very recently because it's hitting the headlines, most definitely. The founder of Quran Club, the Quran Club app, which we'll speak about later, inshallah. My dear brother, Ustad Talha Ghannam. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
How are you?
Alhamdulillah. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm good.
Surviving the fast?
Yes. How's Ramadan going so far?
It's good. Yeah, it's actually, I was worried about this Ramadan,
Yeah.
but it's actually been a lot easier than any other one.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. We were just saying just before the show that we can't even, offer you a glass of water, not even water, the saying goes. Can't offer you anything, but alhamdulillah, jazakallah khair for joining us. I know you've travelled down and you're fasting, and mashallah, you're doing missions in Ramadan.
And I've been travelling the whole month.
Yeah, you've been travelling a lot,
so
right?
It's in my genes at the moment.
Alhamdulillah, but I think that's the beauty of when you're just serving the community, and the Quran, subhanallah, like I've realized the Quran, like Allah honors people through the Quran. It's amazing. When a person like loves the Quran, when a person goes out of their way to propagate and to promote the Quran, I feel like because I've met so many people that are in that field of Quran, I just feel like subhanallah, the Quran opens up doors for you. So I'm sure you must have seen that, right? Like just,
I mean, I'm praying that I'm one of them. I mean, you have to be accepted by Allah, right? So, and I think that's the thing. People think that I'm serving the Quran. I think it's Allah that's honoured us to be able to work in this field. My job is to get people to read Quran. I mean,
that's amazing, yeah.
There's not many people that can kind of wake up every day and think, right, this is kind of mind, body and soul alignment. Actually, one of the things about Ramadan is one of the few times where your mind, body and soul align, because your mind, you can't eat, your body you can't eat, and your soul, you're kind of worshipping Allah. All of them are kind of geared towards that phase. But yeah, alhamdulillah, it's been a great journey so far. It's been crazy growth, alhamdulillah, and it's been just amazing to see Allah's tawfiq kind of coming in, and we're asking people to just continue to pray for us and to use the app, inshallah.
Inshallah. Okay, so I mean, with the Quran, this is the month of the Quran, right? So this is I mean, so far, we're coming towards the end of the month, and it's gone by, of course, super quick. And I guess everyone has that feeling every single year. It's like, okay, this year's going to be the year. And then next thing you know, it's just like, few days, few weeks go by, and then we're into the last 10 days, which is exactly, the time that we're in now. So a lot of people have been reading the Quran, but one thing I want to speak about is more of the connection with the Quran, because a lot of people can read the Quran, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have a connection with it. Or you could listen to the Quran, doesn't necessarily mean you have a connection with it. Does that make sense? So I just want to start with having a connection with the Quran. Like, what does that mean to you? And maybe we could even speak about a few tips how to just help people just make use of those last few days.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've had this discussion with a lot of people. How do you begin a journey with the Quran? People think you're just suddenly going to open Qurtubi and start opening and receiving these divine inspirations and meanings. But it doesn't work like that, and the Quran doesn't reveal itself that way to you. Nor does it reveal to the Prophet ﷺ in that way. The first word of the Quran, it wasn't i'lam, it wasn't idras, it wasn't to know or to study. It was to read. Reading was the first commandment of Allah Azza wa Jal. Out of all commandments, it wasn't to pray, it wasn't to fast, it was to read. And that's got me really reflecting quite a lot. Here's one of the greatest change makers by the testament of non-Muslims, who Michael Hart listed as number one as the most influential person, John Adair listed as the most influential leader, an example of a leader. The first command Allah chose to give him was read. And I think with that, subhanAllah, is how I think you begin your journey of the Quran, how you begin your journey to come to Allah Azza wa Jal. Because if you read, you then begin that path to beginning to know, then you begin that path to beginning to reflect, and then naturally you begin that connection to the Quran. And most people ultimately see it as a mountain, and a mountain is very difficult to climb. But if you see it as just taking one step after another, you have to realize the Quran has no end anyway. So it's a constant process of learning and understanding. So how would you and how should you connect with the Quran? I think doing it in manageable chunks. One of the things within the Quran Club is that we want people to read a single verse a day. Just commit to it. Don't ever drop, no matter what you're doing, that verse that you're going to read. We actually gamified it within the app, so you have a streak that you build. So every day you read, you're leveling up. And if you miss just one day, it goes back to zero. And we've had a few people who are like, "Oh, can you reset it for me?" I was like, "I'm sorry, I can't." But the idea is to begin that journey is to begin with reading, and then after that, of course, open up the translation. Find one that you find comfortable with. There's, alhamdulillah, a lot of amazing translations right now, and just begin to reflect on various parts, understand what Allah is saying and why, and then the greatest form of connecting to the Quran is just to take a moment to... There's two ways to read the Quran, as I'm sure you know. Well, there's three ways specifically. One is to get through the Quran. Yeah. To read as much of the Arabic as you can. That's how Imam Abu Hanifa would read it twice a day. I mean, he wasn't reflecting on every letter and word if he was doing it that quick. The second is to read with an understanding, a kind of a breadth approach. So you want to understand different parts of the Quran, what it's saying and how. The third is the depth approach, where you take a single verse and you reflect on it. The Prophet ﷺ was known for a single, to reflect on a single verse for an entire night as he was praying in Tahajjud, and to be crying and to be thinking. Imam Abu Hanifa, and Imam Shafi, and have many of these great Imma have famous stories of how they reflected on a single verse and came up with many, many rulings and many things. So it's about dividing your time so that on some days you're just reading Quran for the blessing. You're getting one letter as 10 rewards and you're just getting through it. And that's a beautiful thing. Another day you think, look, I want to lead the translation today. I want to understand what it's saying. I need to get the grips of this. And then the third day you think, well, actually, let me really reflect on this single verse. What have different scholars said? What is the story of Iblis and his exile from paradise? Why did that happen? What do the scholars have to say? What's the details of it? And that, I think, is when your Quran journey becomes much more powerful, much more inspiring, inshallah.
See, because a lot of people in Ramadan especially, they do focus on the khatam aspect of things, which is
because it's
trying
sunnah,
to...
right?
Yeah, of course, it's sunnah. Prophet ﷺ did it every Ramadan, no doubt about it. And he used to read to Jibreel alayhi salam, which is like, can you just imagine that gathering, having the Prophet ﷺ recite Quran to Jibreel? And which is great. That's and we're not kind of taking that away from anyone. We're very virtuous in and of itself. Actually, just recently I was reading like you're saying about the scholars of the past, how many khatams. It's just like crazy when you just think like, how do they get the time with everything else that they were doing? Because it's not like they just sat there. They had other responsibilities. They had families. They had like teaching. They had to lead salah. And then so I was reading about like Qatada rahimahullah, how in the first part of Ramadan, every 3 days he'd do a khatam. So when you read that, you're like, okay, every 3 days, not too bad. And then it says when the last 10 days would enter, it was every single day. So I read that and I was like, okay, it's doable. Maybe every 3 days, though maybe not for me, but I can understand. And then you carry on reading, and then you read about who was it, Imam al-Bukhari, where every day one khatam, right? So it's like, okay, that's crazy, yeah. So 30 done by the end of the month. And then I read about Imam al-Shafi'i. His student says that like every Ramadan, 2 a day without fail. That's 60 khatams.
They say it's a karama for him,
It's crazy, like subhanallah. So you kind of read stuff like that and you're like, how on earth did they manage to do it? Like,
Yeah.
how much barakah did they have in their
I mean, they
time?
say it's a gift that Allah gave them, because it's
Yeah.
like how just calculating the time to read
Yeah.
60 chapters of the Quran within 24 hours.
Yeah.
Allah must have given a gift of, barakah
Yeah,
in
yeah,
the
yeah.
time. Which actually makes you think about it. People
Yeah.
make an excuse that they don't have time to read Quran, and they don't have time to. So these people were the busiest of all people. I mean, the number of books they wrote, and the number of students they had, and they must have had an immense amount of responsibility to their communities. But yet they managed to fit that in.
Yeah.
And then when we hear these out of the world numbers,
Yeah.
it just makes you think. Actually, if I give time for Allah, Allah gives time for me. He opens up my time.
That's a good point. So yeah, so on the khatam points, that's one thing, and then but the thing that you're focusing more on is the reflection as well, which is like the next stage.
Yeah.
Reflecting over the Quran, which I think a lot of people maybe aren't doing, or maybe they want to do, but they just don't know how to go about it.
Sure.
You know, some people are actually quite apprehensive and scared. Like, I don't have knowledge. How could you possibly expect me to reflect over the Quran? Shouldn't I have a teacher to guide me through that? So what would your approach be maybe to just begin, like for anyone out there, maybe doesn't even understand Arabic, but a complete beginner at this stage, what would your first kind of steps be?
Yeah. So we have a Sunday school, and I've been teaching this year for about 60, 70 different students on reflecting on the Quran. We came up with various different ways of what they should do and what they shouldn't do, and you set out the rules of kind of guidance as to what you can and can't reflect on. I said, look, you're not going to derive legal rulings from the Quran. So anytime you read something that's a legal thing, don't begin to interpret it.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, and then maybe ask you a question in class and we can talk about it. What your role to do is to try and derive kind of spiritual fawaid, understandings, beneficial aspects of the verse. And what we said was we came up with this lawnmowers approach, which you think what's a lawnmowers, but it's basically a series of different things you need to look at. And each of those is an aspect of a verse that you can look. So, for example, an A is for look at another verse that relates to this verse, and how they're connected, and why Allah has mentioned this in this particular part, that in another part. You've got N for kind of the surah name. So what's the connection between the surah name and this particular thing? You've got the names of Allah Azza wa Jal. So one of the really interesting parts of a verse is the name Allah chooses to begin it or end it or mention it in there. There's stories of people who'd recite the Quran and they'd make a mistake by saying the wrong name at the end, and someone would correct them, and they said, well, how do you know? And they said, well, it doesn't fit that this verse ends with this name. So, An Allah Ghafurun Rahim versus An Allah Alimun Hakim. That Allah is all merciful and forgiving.
A lot of people take that for granted, at that point. It's really interesting how you just think it's just random, like Allah just put random names at the end of verses, Ghafur Rahim, Tawwab Rahim. But actually, you're right. Actually, if you look at the wider context of the verse or even that passage, it'd be like, oh, that makes sense. I think there's a famous story about this, actually, about this one famous grammarian. I think it's like Imam al-Asma'i, maybe. And how he went to, this is literally off the top of my head, so I might, don't fully quote me on this, but where he went, he was in that desert, and then there's a few Bedouins there, and someone recited the Quran, a verse about the thief, السارق والسارقة فاقطعوا أيديهما. So basically Allah just setting the law about theft. And then at the end of that verse, it's Azizun Hakim. But the one who was reciting it said Ghafurur Rahim, made a mistake. And then the Bedouin, who literally had no knowledge of the Quran, was not Hafidh, said, oh, you made a mistake. It's not Ghafurur Rahim. And the guy turned around and was like, how could you possibly know? Like, because that doesn't fit in with the context. Allah is laying down a law of theft, and basically he's like asserting his authority here. Why would he say he's Ghafurur Rahim? Why would he say he's merciful? It should be Aziz and Hakim, because he's saying like he's Aziz, he's almighty, and he's all wise for laying down this law. And the guy asked him, are you a Hafidh? He's like, no, I just know my Arabic language probably.
That's the same story I was thinking about.
Is it?
I couldn't remember the one.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Yeah, basically, I mean, the thing is though, when you do that, so for example, the famous one in the Basmala, Allah begins the surah Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And I asked the kids, okay, what does that mean? And they go, oh, bro, there raise their hands. Oh, in the name of Allah, the most gracious, most merciful. It's like, okay, firstly, what does gracious, what does merciful mean? They're like, blank face. I was like, okay, fine. Rahim, they both come from the stem Rahma. Why is Allah mentioned the merciful, the merciful? Or why are you trying to create these distinctions between the words? What's the essence of the difference between them? Blank faces, no one knows. And I was like, the scholars have written books on this as to why Allah begins this. And there's many, many things. Imam Razi mentions it's actually beginning the names of Allah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Malik al-Quddus, and carries on. But one of the really interesting ones I kind of took a lot of benefit from is Bismillah ar-Rahman is a sigh of intensity. It's very merciful, like the utmost mercy you can possibly imagine. There's nothing greater than that level of mercy. And then ar-Rahim is someone to be consistently merciful. Like if someone's Kareem, it's generosity. Someone is generous not by giving once, but by giving all the time, every time. So Allah Azza wa Jalla, when He's saying in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the ever merciful, it's probably a good translation. He's Ar-Rahman, He's always the highest level. Ar-Rahim, consistently and always. But what you do is, I mean, these little gems, they don't come overnight. Often you have to open books and you have to listen to people. But what you can do is you can begin to see where these kind of little gems are found and how Allah kind of puts specific words. There's a Sheikh Kabisi, who we used to listen a lot to. He's on TV. He had a series where he would go through the words of the Quran, and he would use words that Allah would say in a particular place and say, why has He used this word and not the equivalent synonym in the same place? So halumma, ta'alu, right? They're the same meaning. It was like come together or gather together. Why has He used that in a specific place and this in a different place? And you get some fascinating insights. You know, this specific word has been chosen for this specific verse. So, I mean, I'll give an example which probably the listeners would really understand. The famous verse of Sadaqah. مثل الذين ينفقون في سبيل الله كمثل حبة, right? The one who gives in the sake of Allah is like the one who gives a seed. Why does Allah use the word seed here? Like, interesting, right? You never really stop and think about it. The analogy continues. It's like planting a seed and then it grows, 7 corns and each corn has 100 seeds. But why seed specifically? There's lots of different analogies you can give. Well, a seed, there's many. I did a series on this, like a reflection. But a seed, what do you do when you get a seed? You dig a hole, you plant it in the ground, and you cover it up. Now imagine someone who never knew what a seed was and biology, like a 5-year-old, and you just gave him this gift. You said, here's some seeds. And you say, look, in order for you to benefit and to use this to its true extent, you have to dig this hole, put the seeds in, cover it up, and leave it. And every now and then you come and water it and look after it. What would they think? They think that's just madness, right? Why would I throw away? Imagine I gave you my iPhone. I said, look, bury it in the ground, water it, and something amazing will happen. It just doesn't make sense. But then what happens? After you give that and you act on that, everybody knows that that's how you use a seed. That's where things grow and that's where things come from. So when I give you £10 and I say to you, look, the actual way that you're meant to use this £10 is to give it in sadaqah. But not just give it in sadaqah, you have to follow up. You have to check up on the person. You have to plan around that strategy. It's not just give and go. I think a lot of people misinterpret the hadith of people giving secretly. It's giving secretly so you're not boastful. It's not giving secretly so you give and forget. But you plant it in the ground, you water it, and then what happens? It will give you much more seeds in the future. Just like we understand how a seed has that benefit. The same person who created the seed has created your money. So when he said give £10, you're actually going to get more in return. Just from a single word. And there's lots and lots of other fawaid and benefits as well. But I think that sort of reflection, there's another one, maybe the listeners can do it and comment, but why has Allah said, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ? Why has He said, and hold tight to the rope of Allah Azza wa Jal? He could have mentioned other analogies, but why rope specifically? So these sorts of reflections I think really, really interesting. And I think kind of diverged from your point. How do people actually and should reflect? The Quran's a journey. It's about beginning a step and kind of taking it. And I already mentioned about doing this every single day. The first step for most of the people who don't speak Arabic is to just get a good translation. There's Professor Abdul Halim, there's Dr. Musharraf Hussain, who's written a new one now. There's one by Mustafa Khattab in Canada, who've written some kind of clear, concise, easy access. We've integrated some of those into our app as well so people can read them. But just begin by just, as a first glance, understanding what it is you're doing. And then secondly, if you can, find a teacher or find someone who you can sit with, who can really open up some of these meanings for you, inshallah.
Yeah, I think there's some really, really good, interesting points there, especially for the reflection side of things. And translations as well. I think that's really important because I think, again, alhamdulillah, now we're getting the introduction of more clearer translations because people, again, were put off, I don't want to read like very old, archaic English, lo and behold, and, thy. So now the fact that we're kind of breaking things down, I think that's very important. I think listening as well to different speakers is also really good. Just to people who are, even if it's one kind of topic in the Quran, just breaking it down. Because I think the more you sit with people who understand the Quran and giving gems, like for example, you've mentioned quite a few there, mashallah. So imagine just sitting with someone like that or listening to a lecture every day or every now and again, where you're connecting with the Quran. I think it just, in your own language, it makes things so much easier, much easier to digest. So reflection of the Quran, that's great, because again, we said we're in Ramadan, so we wanted something practical for the listeners and the viewers to kind of take away how they can engage with the Quran. But there's also, we could say, there's a downside, there's a danger to that as well. We've already mentioned going too deep into it, especially if you're not too well equipped or well versed with the Quran, coming up with your own interpretations. Where do you draw the line before, like, a person could be in deep reflection over a verse and then come out with 70 of their own, not rulings, like we said, don't go into the rulings. I think, by the way, that's a very good principle to begin with for anyone listening to that. Okay, Surah Al-Baqarah, for example, you're going to come across like hundreds of legal rulings. So that side of things, leave it to the experts and the people of knowledge and the fuqaha. But just in general, like you said, the fawaid, the benefits, the gems, the wisdoms in the Quran, like, where would you kind of draw the line?
I mean, first of all, the command to reflect isn't from me or from you. It's from Allah Azza wa Jal. أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ. Do they not reflect on the Quran? Or is it عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا? Or is it come down on kind of locked hearts? Or paraphrasing the translation. But the key thing is, how and what and where do you draw the line? And the answer to that isn't straightforward. The best answer I can give is find a teacher who you can approach and ask whenever you do have a question or you do have an understanding, and someone who can guide you through the way. But I know that's not always accessible, especially nowadays. Many people aren't necessarily qualified or accessible. So there's a lot of good series you can do which guide you as to where and what you can kind of learn and reflect on and how that works. I think anytime you sense that you're kind of going into a territory that you're unsure about, like we said, don't go into any legal rulings. That's a science in itself, how to derive rulings. I'll give you an example for those listeners. The famous verse of wudu. إذا كنتم للصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق وامسحوا برؤوسكم. Right? So Allah is commanding people, when you want to go and pray, go and wash your face and hands to the elbow and wipe, and he says برؤوسكم here. Now this letter ba, single letter in the Quran, scholars have differed, and there's the formation of the four madhabs, each one giving a different ruling on what they interpret this ba to be. The Hanafis interpret it in the context of a hadith, saying it's referring to the forelock, the front head, and they say you have to wipe a quarter of the head. The Shafis say it's actually referring to the ba'diyah, just referring to a single strand of hair would be sufficient to complete your wudu, because you're just doing a thing. And the Malikis say it's actually za'idah, it's not necessary, and you have to wipe the entirety of the head, or not necessary is the wrong word, but it's wiping the entirety of the head is the obligation here. A single letter, you get 3 different interpretations. Now, why have they got those interpretations is the key, because they're all looking at different methodologies, different context, and you don't have access to that. In fact, probably most of us don't even stop and think, what's this ba?
Yeah.
So for us to start picking out legal rulings is dangerous. But what you can do is when Allah says, أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ فَذَلِكَ الَّذِي يَدُعُّ الْيَتِيمَ وَلَا يَحُضُّ عَلَى طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ. Have you seen the one who denies ad-deen? Not religion, ad-deen here is the judgment. And then what's the first thing when someone says, do you deny accountability? فَذَلِكَ الَّذِي يَدُعُّ الْيَتِيمَ. The one who ignores the rights of the orphan, or kind of oversees the rights of the orphan. Why is he mentioned orphan as the first thing, as Allah taking judgment? That you can reflect on. Why is he specifically mentioning these examples? Why is he mentioning not giving food to those in need? Yeah. Then why does he immediately go فَوَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ? then he curses those who pray. Which is, wait, what? How can you curse someone who prays? And then Allah continues, الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ. Those who, when they pray, they're heedless. They're not paying attention. And what's the connection between that and the earlier verses mentioned? That's what people should be reflecting on. That's a spiritual benefit. It's an immense thing that you can gain. And I think that's a somewhat rough schema. But it's important, I think, people feel comfortable to be able to open the Quran and read, and it's important that they have access to someone who they can go to ask their questions. Till today, I've been studying for about 8-9 years now, but I still go to my teacher and ask him, what's this mean? How does this mean? And so on. It's difficult, and I would never see myself as a scholar just because I know what a scholar means. But having the ability to, or the comfort to go to the Quran and derive its meaning, I think is really, really nice. I'll finish with one story. There's a friend of mine who was applying for jobs, applying. We all know what it's like. It's very stressful. Kept failing, kept getting rejection. And he thought, this is just not working. And then once he landed an interview, the interview went well, got invited to the next round, and then he was on the final round, the last stage. He's like, inshallah, I'll get this. So then he kind of went to the interview, thought it went well, came back home, and he got a call, picked up the phone, and they said, unfortunately, you haven't got the job. So he was broken-hearted. So he thought, I'm going to seek comfort in the Quran. So he went to the Quran and he opened it, and he opened to the first verses. He said, I'm going to open the Quran, whichever's the first verse I read, this is like Allah talking to me. He opened it up, and the first verse he saw was the Surah An-Naml. أَتَى أَمْرُ اللَّهِ فَلَا تَسْتَعْجِلُوهُ. The decree of Allah has already come, so don't rush it. I mean, that is a reflection of the Quran. That connection with the Quran, I think, is what we need to establish. Just an ability to turn to it in moments of need, and turn to it in just daily activity.
The Quran speaks to everyone differently, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because everyone's going through their own set of trials and problems. So it's amazing how one person could find one benefit in a particular verse, and another person reading it could find. And we're not saying either is right or wrong. Just saying that, like, that's what, how it relates to you in your particular life, which I think that's the beauty of the Quran. It's universal throughout all times, throughout all ages, different people from different walks of life. Even in the time of the Prophet, whether it was your Abu Bakr as your closest companions, whether it was a Bedouin or whether it was a poor companion, like, everyone came together through the Quran. And since you're mentioning stories as well, because as we're talking about reflections in the Quran, I think that's actually probably one of the best places to start is stories in the Quran, isn't it? Because, of course, if you jump straight into, like I said, Baqarah or a surah which naturally is going to have a lot of legal rulings, then it might be more difficult to reflect. But if you go to the stories, which actually, subhanAllah, was probably in the Meccan era, that's Allah was revealing mainly stories, isn't it? To kind of soften the hearts and strengthen the iman of the believers. Mainly it was stories before the Medinan period where a lot of the legal rulings were coming down. So I think that's, for me, like when I kind of, when I'm in classes, when I discuss to other people, I always mention this point, like there's like, that's kind of like Allah teaching us where to begin himself. He's showing us, like, very new Muslims, people who had just come into Islam, into the faith in Mecca at the time. They're struggling, they're going through their sets of problems, they're getting, tortured, oppressed, psychologically, mentally abused, and they're kind of struggling, they're trying to find their feet. So Allah is like revealing stories of previous prophets and nations, how they went through their trials and tribulations, and that kind of strengthened their hearts, as Allah says in the Quran. And then later on, after 14 years, then the legal rulings start coming down. So maybe that's kind of teaching us as well, like, if when you start your journey, start with stories. And there's so many stories in the Quran. I mean, Surah Yusuf, one of my personal favourites. I think just from that surah, like, I don't know if you know the sheikh that's done the PhD on Surah Yusuf. And he took 1,000 lessons from Surah Yusuf.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I have to find that.
Yeah, I haven't found the paper yet, but, like, can you imagine? And he's a contemporary scholar.
Oh, wow.
But he's done 1,000 lessons just on Surah Yusuf.
Yeah.
And it's not a long, like, Surah Yusuf is not a long surah at all.
Yeah.
Compared to the bigger surahs towards the beginning of the Quran.
Yeah.
So I think stories is amazing. Like, you can just sit there, literally, read a story and just think, wow, why did Allah test Yusuf like this? Just from the beginning of the story with that relationship between Yusuf and Yaqub, the father and son relationship,
Mm.
you could just sit there and reflect. As a
Yeah.
parent, you could take so much away from it.
Yeah.
As a son or as a daughter, you could take so much away from it. So different people can come together and take so much away. So what do you think about like stories in the Quran as like a starting point, or just in general? Like, what's your favorite story, by the way, in the Quran? I might as well ask you something.
Favorite's tough. I was apprehending that question.
Is it?
Anticipating. I was like, wait, I don't know. There's a story I was thinking about recently, and it's because of the devil being locked away. I was thinking actually about the story of Iblis and that situation. I mean, here's a person who, I mean, people claim they don't believe in Allah because they don't see him. Here's a person who stood in front of Allah, who spoke to Allah, and he didn't believe. Like, can you imagine Allah commanding you directly to do something, and then you just go no? I mean, what kind of level of arrogance is that? But what I think it does is it opens up a lot of the psychology of disbelief as to where it actually stems from, and people actually making an excuse, because he gave the most eloquent excuses for why I didn't believe, and had this just been this, they've said that he was asked, why didn't you prostrate? He goes, how can I prostrate to other than Allah? And it was kind of, if Allah's commanded you to do something, the essence of slavehood is that you obey him, not question why or bring yourself into it. So there's a fascinating discussion, is it in the beginning of Surah Al-A'raf, where the discussion between Allah Azza wa Jal and Iblis takes place as to why did you not obey me? And he says, I'm better than him. I was created from fire and he's made from clay. And even if that was true, what it does is it shows a lot of the psychological elements of the imperfections of kind of disbelievers and believers, that they think that these external things matter. But what's interesting is the contrast between Adam alayhi salam, Iblis, and the angels, because all three spoke to Allah Azza wa Jal, and all three were in that setting. And Allah often gives stories in threes, actually, like three examples, which is, we know as a psychological tool, is a very powerful thing. So angels had no will; they had to obey. Iblis had a will and disobeyed, and Adam had a will and sought forgiveness for the mistake that he did. Similarly, in Surah At-Tawbah, you had the story of the three people who didn't go on the expedition the Prophet ﷺ asked them to do. One had a valid excuse because they were blind and they weren't able and they were crying. The second were the hypocrites who didn't want to go and made their excuses. And then the third were those who were sinful and repented. So look at the way that Allah gives these. One is the people who obey and do it. The second is those who don't want to do it in the first place. And the third is those who don't do it but then regret it. And I think that theme, be interesting to see how that appears within the Quran and the consistency within that of the kind of the three states of human beings: those who deny, those who obey, and those who regret.
Very interesting. There's so much. That's the thing. We were just saying before the show, is like the Quran is never ending, isn't it? It's just when you start your journey, I think a lot of people think, okay, let me just study for this amount of years and that's it, I'll get it. It's not. It doesn't work like that, because the more you open up the Quran and you reflect over it, the more, subhanAllah, that you find there's actually so much that you can pull from it. Like every time I go back to a surah that I've already read on, like I always learn something new. There's always going to be one tafsir, a new tafsir that you read with different perspective from a different scholar, and you're just like, wow, your mind is blown. Like I thought I knew what this verse meant, but now I've just got a complete new different perspective on it. So I think, again, like anyone that's kind of starting that journey towards just trying to reflect over the Quran should never think, okay, it's a very short term thing. It's long term, and I guess again, a lot of people feel frustrated as well that I'm still very behind. I can't finish the Quran. I can't. But I don't think you can really finish it in that sense. You can finish memorizing it, you can finish reading it, but you can't finish learning and studying, and you can't finish reflecting.
I mean, with the Quran Club, we set up this app to build a community around the Quran, so we can help each other, we can learn from each other, and ultimately, because the endeavour requires us to come together to do it. The hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in Sahih Muslim is that people come together to read the Quran and study it together. The two go hand in hand. And the first verses of the Quran, as I mentioned already, were the words read, Iqra. Allah wants to build a community around the essence of reading Quran. And for the Quran Club, that's why we're doing it that way. To read together, to reflect together, and to really benefit together. I mean, I can't think of a better way for Muslim community to come together than through the Quran. Imagine if the way I connect with you isn't through kind of WhatsApp or Facebook or Instagram, but it's through the Quran. We kind of come together, we can reflect on this particular passage and so on and so forth. And it becomes this new way of connecting. I say this analogy to people all the time. I say there's a book that 1.5 billion people read every single day. And they've literally changed the world. You know, governments opening the doors for them, and they're constantly considering these people. They're trying to pander to their needs. The problem is it's called Facebook. It's not called Quran. It's not called Quran book.
I thought you were going for the Quran there.
So, but the thing is imagine if we as Muslims, if the dunya, if this world can open up such doors for someone who reads something that's so artificial, intangible, like Facebook. Imagine what Allah will do if we connect and we read the Quran book together. Not only will we have the world opening up for us, we'll have the heavens opening up for us. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which actually, the new Imam in Cambridge mentioned this. He goes, you know the hadith where the angels are sent to roam around the earth to attend gatherings of paradise? And the gatherings are people who come together to study together and to remember Allah specifically. He said, for the first time ever on this app, we've literally got a worldwide gathering. I mean, literally, at any moment you open the app, from our end, we've got between 1,000 and 2,000 people reading at that moment. And we know people read at different times. But that's the lowest it gets to. So literally, every single second, you can just join in a gathering. That's a gathering of paradise that's taking place around the world. So there's these angels, you can just imagine, flying around, trying to gather and attend these gatherings, alhamdulillah.
What was the vision behind Quran Club then, and how did you start?
I mean, it started as a WhatsApp group.
WhatsApp group, okay.
Yeah, it came from a friend who sent me a message and said, "Why don't we do this thing where we send each other verses and we confirm that we've read it and we could read together?" Okay. And my initial reaction was, "Oh, not another WhatsApp group." And then I didn't like that, so I thought, well, let me volunteer to do it. And then it kind of 20 people joined, and I thought, well, if we're sending it to 20 people, how much harder can it be to send it to more people? So we just did a post telling people this is what we're doing, and overnight we got about 5,000 people.
Wow.
That's now about 20,000 people in that group. So WhatsApp, once it gets to those numbers, becomes very, very difficult. So we thought we have to create an app. So we studied it a bit and we kind of looked into it. And the idea is, look, there's 1.8 billion Muslims. We're all very strongly connected with one another, both in our faith, but almost, literally, some of our closest friends and stuff will be Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ described us as one body. But yet there isn't a single space online for Muslims to meet together and to connect. People have done it all the time. They've tried to. They've created spaces for Muslims. But it's quite a loose definition to say, look, Muslims come here. So what we thought is, what brings Muslims together? Well, the hadith, as I mentioned before, is that the Quran brings people together. The Prophet ﷺ praised people who come together to read the Quran. So we thought, why don't we build our community around the Quran? Every single person coming, and they just read their Quran together. And then the second motivation was this idea of multiples, of earning more reward. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in Tirmidhi, where he states that a person who guides someone, the one who guides and encourages someone to do a good deed, is like the one who does the good deed themselves. We all know the power of social kind of movements and people coming together. So if we can create a movement where people come together to read, then we'll be sharing their reward. So if you're reading by yourself, you're just, inshallah, getting the benefit. But if you're following what the Prophet told us to, which is to read together and gaining that benefit, then you'll share the reward of everyone who comes to take part, because hopefully you've encouraged them to take part with you. So for me, I actually started at the same place you mentioned at the beginning, which is reading the stories of Imam Shafi'i finishing the Quran twice a day. I was like, how can I compete with that? And I thought the one thing we have to our advantage in this day and age is the number of Muslims. So why don't we use that to make something beneficial? So if we get the 1 billion people in the world today reading the Quran together, which is mind-blowing, that's more people than have lived probably the last 500 centuries, right? So we can do more together and we can really compete with those earlier generations, inshallah, by trying to earn good deeds, by doing things in that volume. And the final thing is, I really wanted a way to make this deen, and specifically scholars, accessible. I wanted to facilitate for them to really get out there and to enable them to be within the community. And I thought the way that has to work is that there has to be some form of business model or some form of venture which is pushing money into scholarship. So if we can create a social media, a place where people are coming together to read Quran, in order to improve that product, you have to invest in the Quran, which means you're investing in scholars, which means that we're constantly going to be producing new tafsirs, we're constantly going to be making new videos, we're going to bring more scholars, we're going to bring masjids on board and all these things. And it becomes really, really exciting because we've created a vehicle that is naturally going to be investing into these sorts of things and investing the kind of sums that you can't do on a voluntary basis. So there's a big vision. We've planned it out for the next few years, inshallah. But this Ramadan is kind of critical. So especially now we're in the last 10 nights, we've kind of got this challenge that we've got this amazing feature. It's called the Guarantee Laylatul Qadr feature. And what you can do is you can automate your giving every night of the last 10 nights to guarantee you catch Laylatul Qadr. So you just go on the app and you say, I'm going to give £10 every night, and then automatically our app will take £10 from the account that you give, such that you're guaranteed to catch it because you've given £10 every single night. So it's a really cool feature, and we've got various other things. But what we're trying to do is to show the world that Muslims come together around the Quran. And if we can show that, then inshallah we'll really begin to open up doors and we can build lots of features and produce lots of tafsirs and content, inshallah.
Inshallah. Sounds amazing. So this Ramadan, what's it been looking like so far in terms of like the engagement, the Muslims from around the world coming together?
It's been crazy. I could never have kind of predicted it, but we've passed 250,000 downloads.
Really?
That's 250,000 people reading Quran on the app. And we know every single verse, who it was read by, when, in which country, in which city, their gender, their age, as long as they give the information, of course. But it's been insane. I mean, we're reading upwards of 1 million verses a day.
Wow.
Ayahs of Quran. We've got this, we found this phenomenon which I find really funny. We call it the school run. So between 2 and 3 p.m. there's a surge of reading on the app. And basically our idea is that we think it's the mums or the dads that go and pick up their kids on the school run, waiting for their kids. They open up the app and start reading Quran. So we're seeing people reading Quran in a way they've never done it before. And what's really beautiful about reading it on the Quran Club is you can take it with you wherever you go. So it's no longer just a book that's at home, but in those micro moments where you're waiting for the school run, you can just pull out your phone, read 1, 2, 3 ayahs, a couple of pages, and then close it and then pick it up next time you go to the shops, next time you go for iftar at someone's. You've constantly got it with you. And I think that makes it something that's very, very unique in the sense of your khatam and your reading is there wherever you go, which is much better than kind of a mushaf in that sense. So the stats have been incredible. We've got a 1 million page target. We've also got a £1 million target to try and raise money for charity. And at the moment we're smashing the page target. Inshallah the money target picks up as well. But we want to really try and make a positive impact on the world, inshallah. And the money's all it goes to charity, inshallah.
It sounds amazing. I actually downloaded the app this Ramadan, alhamdulillah. It's very beneficial, and I think it's what's needed, most definitely, because it's not just the app, it's not just a Quran app where you're just reading. There's so many different other features as well. I think, mashallah, it's amazing, and I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses you guys for the amazing work that you've been doing, mashallah, with Quran Club. And of course, anyone listening and watching definitely has to, because mashallah, the Feed family all over the world now, mashallah, different parts of the world. So this is not just for people here in the UK. Anywhere you are, inshallah, make sure you download the app and it's reading Quran at the end of the day in this month of Ramadan, these last final 10 days, inshallah. Let's make use of it, let's take advantage. I wanted to kind of end with some advice, because Ramadan is, of course, soon will come to an end, and of course we pray that Allah accepts all of our actions throughout this month, inshallah. But since we're on the topic of the Quran, Does Quran Club, the app, does it automatically delete itself on Eid day after Ramadan, or does it carry on? It's a whole year thing, right?
It's a whole year
Yeah.
thing.
Okay. Cool. That's good. That's good to know, because it seems like a lot of us, we just delete the app in our
Yeah.
in our own heart
Yeah.
sometimes. It's very difficult to keep up with the Quran.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that, like, as if I'm undermining or looking down on anyone. Like, I myself struggle.
Yeah.
Like, the kind of motivation I have in Ramadan to recite the Quran, the way I'm on it right now, I don't have that outside of Ramadan. So what would your tips be to someone to kind of carry on that journey after Ramadan? What would you say?
It's all about sustainability. It's all about having the foresight to be able to predict, okay, I'm not going to be doing a khatam every month. Realistically, I barely can read a page at the moment. So just begin by committing to reading even a single verse a day. On the app, on the Quran Club, we've got this streak feature. Every day you read, you're leveling up. But open it up every day. Just make sure you read a single verse and just see how far you can get. And in no time, you'll be finishing the Quran once, twice, 3 times a year, inshallah. And you'll find yourself picking it up. And the second thing is that the Quran is with you wherever you go. And make use of the micro moments, we call it. A friend of mine, Hassan Shibli, he described it as, this micro moment of, when you're on the bus and you're waiting, rather than opening Instagram or Facebook, or open up the verse of the Quran and read just like you do in Ramadan. Because it's funny, because most people in Ramadan do it, but outside Ramadan they forget. So you make the use of those moments in between the moments. So when you're walking to something, most people now are probably walking and looking at their phone. They shouldn't be. They should be looking at the road. But read the Quran in those moments. When you're waiting for someone, read the Quran. And actually something really exciting with the Quran Club, we're actually planning to use because we gather a lot of data of people reading and stuff, and as long as they submit it to us, we're going to use like the most advanced behavioral theory and kind of technology to try and, in the same way Facebook makes you addicted to opening it regularly, we're going to try and do that with the Quran. So obviously in a positive way, but getting people to read and engage the Quran and creating incentives within the Quran Club app. So we're trying to use technology to help facilitate it, to combat some of these negative forces that are at play in the world. But at the end of the day, it's all down to your own will. So if you make the task smaller, just say it's a verse a day. We've had the WhatsApp group I mentioned we started 4.5 years ago. We've now completed the entire Quran cover to cover almost 1.5 times. And I know for a fact, many of the people who've been reading with us never read the Quran before. They've told me that. They said the only Quran they read is through that WhatsApp group. And now through the Quran Club app. But it's we sent them half a page a day with the translation. And they just do that every single day, and they got through it in no time. And subhanallah, that's how Allah benefits things. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Qalilun tadumu alayh khayrun min kathirun." Can't remember the ending of this. But a small amount that you are consistent on is greater than a large amount that you're inconsistent on. So it's all in the small deeds, inshallah.
Inshallah. I think that's a great piece of advice to end on. To continue, inshallah, the journey of the Quran after Ramadan by reciting, even if it's a small amount every single day. I think it's very realistic for most of us, because everyone's just so busy nowadays, and everyone's just got so many commitments that they're trying to juggle. So I think it's just a realistic way of keeping in touch with the Quran, rather than just completely putting it to a side. Or nowadays it's not the book, nowadays it's the apps like Quran Club, where it's just kind of inactive for a year or so. But inshallah, we pray that Allah allows us to become people of the Quran, inshallah. Ustad Talha, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. In the month of Ramadan, I know it's a difficult one, but you didn't fall asleep, which is good. No, alhamdulillah. And even in terms of the Quran Club, I wish you all the best. I've been following your journey, even on your personal page, just to see the growth, mashallah. And it's just every day it's growing, which is I'm honestly very proud to see. And I pray that Allah SWT continues to bless you guys. Again, all of our Feed viewers, listeners, please, inshallah, do download the app and read the Quran and build your connection with the Quran, because especially for those of you who are struggling, you feel like you need to take time out, and on previous podcast episodes, we've spoken about that embedding that spirituality within your lives. And if you got your phone with you everywhere you go, so you might as well make use of it, download the right apps like this app, inshallah, to help you bring the Quran more into your life. Barakallah feek. Thank you so much. Inshallah, we hope to maybe have you back on soon to update us the crazier stats, inshallah, as to how people have come together to recite more Quran. Jazakumullah khairan. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. Inshallah, hopefully you found this podcast episode beneficial. Continue to make dua for us in this blessed month of Ramadan, inshallah. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe to us on iTunes as well. Spread the word, make dua, and we'll be back with you very soon. Take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.